This is Jim Christensen, and the following video clip is an excerpt from my workshop on jimchristensenphotography.com that explains how photographers and digital artists can use Photoshop and Photoshop elements effectively. I guess every photographer has had the problem of stray people wandering into the frame when we're trying to shoot. This is such a common problem that there have been many solutions proposed for how to fix this. Not surprisingly, the technique that I'll show you involves using non-destructive editing, using layers and layer masks in Photoshop and Photoshop elements. And I'm going to do that by showing you 4 examples of pictures where I've had this problem and then how I fixed them. All right, let's take a look. You may recognize this image. This is the Höchstgrimskirche in Reykjavik. And although there weren't a lot of people around when I took this picture, there were a few. For me, they're just distractions in this picture. I'm just going to quickly show you how I took them out of this image, but I won't do the whole retouch on this. I am going to zoom in. So I'm going to do the Command plus to zoom in on this image. I'll scroll over to get the people in the middle of the frame there. I'm going to create an empty RGB layer using that icon at the bottom of the layers panel on the right. There we go. It's an RGB layer with no pixels on it. Now I'm going to go get my spot healing brush. The mode is set to replace. The type is content aware. Sample all layers is checked. And the hardness of my brush is about 2/3. And I'm going to take this and size it so it's just a little bit, maybe about the size of the head of this person. And what I'm going to do is click and drag over this person. So instead of just clicking in and releasing as I would to take out a speck of dust, I'm going to click and drag so that it outlines a larger area to spot heal. And I'll release. And now that person is just about gone, right? I mean, there are some little remnants around, but like there's a dark shadow down here. I can go click on that. This line in the pavement is a little uneven. If I really care about that, I can go get my clone stamp, and I can sample the image somewhere on the line where it's straight, move over to where the line gets crooked, and just copy some whoops, I got to up the flow. I could copy some pixels over from where the line is straight to where it's not, and I could straighten that line out. All right, but let me go back to my spot healing brush, work on this second guy, make a little bigger brush, and again, I'm just going to highlight enough, I can take out his water bottle while I'm at it, to cover him and release. Now that one didn't work quite as well, but I don't have to do it all in one shot, right? I can go back and take another swing at it and fix it. Here again, if there's little artifacts, like there's a little glitch on the wall here, I can go get my clone stamp again and make it a little smaller and clone some of this wall from where it's good to where it's not good and fix that up. Let me go back to my spot healing brush again and get these last 2. These are smaller, so they should be a little easier to remove. There we go. A few little artifacts there. I'll click and make those go away. One last person. There we go. I'm going to do a Command 0. So if the people are small, you can take them out just as if they were, twigs or specks of dust or some other minor distraction in the image. But when the people are a more significant part of the frame, we have to use another tool. In the next example, the people are a bigger part of the image. Here's a picture of a lovely young lady in the Met Museum in New York City. And again, because I've done non-destructive editing with layers and layer masks, if we look over on the right at the layer stack here, we can see I've got several layers, and one of them is the background layer, which is more or less what I started with. So if I Option or Alt click on the eyeball for that layer, we can see that this is the capture, and there are some stray people walking around here. I'd like to take those out, but that spot healing brush just isn't going to do it here. So I'm going to have to use my go-to tool, which is the clone stamp. And let me explain to you how that tool works. It's got an unfortunate name, and although it can be used as a stamp, it's much more useful to think of it as a cloning brush. But let me demonstrate here. So I have the background layer, and I'll highlight that, and I'll create a new RGB layer just above that that starts out with no pixels on it. Now I'll get my clone stamp tool, which is this one right here. The icon looks a little bit like a rubber stamp. And if I make that brush, I'm calling it a brush already because that's the way I think of it. But if I make the edge of that very hard, and now I go and size it up using my right square bracket key to be big enough to cover this lady's hat, and I Option or Alt click on that point in the image, that determines the place from which the clone stamp will copy pixels from. So it hasn't modified anything yet. It's just set the point that when I do start cloning, this will be the place where it starts copying pixels from. Now if I move that brush to where I want the pixels copied to, and I just click and release without dragging the mouse, it in fact does work like a stamp, right? It's taken a snapshot of those pixels at that point that I set the copy from point with the Option or Alt click, and then when I left click over here, it made a copy of those pixels on this layer 13. So if I Option or Alt click on the eyeball for this layer, you can see, sure enough, it's made a perfect copy of the pixels where I sampled to this new location. Now, I don't find that useful, so I never use the clone stamp tool in that way. Let me do a Command Z to undo. And now let me do pretty much the same thing, but I'm going to change the hardness of the clone stamp to 0, so it's very soft. Let me do the same thing. I'll sample right there. I'll go and I'll click and release there. And now let's do the same thing. I'm going to Option or Alt click on the eyeball there. And you can see that it's made a copy, but the edges are very, very soft, right? We no longer have that sharp circular edge on the copied pixels. Now, let me undo once more. I'll do a Command Z so that layer is blank. Let me turn on the background again. And now I'm going to do the same thing. I'll sample. I'll set what I call sample, setting the place where copying starts from on her hat. And I'll go over here, but rather than just click and release, I'm going to click and drag and then release. So I'll click, drag down, and release. Now, let's Option or Alt click on layer 13 to see what it did. You can see now it hasn't just copied that circle where I set the sample point or the copy from point, but it started copying there, and then as I dragged, the copy is tracking the motion of my mouse. So it's copying down from the sample point and then down to the copy to point. This is the way I always use the so-called clone stamp, or what I think of as the clone brush, is I copy pixels almost always with a soft edge from one place to another. All right? Now, a few settings that are important besides the hardness and the size of the brush. Opacity and flow control the opacity of the pixels that are copied, and in 100% it copies them fully. If I back off either of those parameters, it will just copy what you might think of as a translucent copy, right? Not fully opaque, but somewhat see-through. This align checkbox up here, also very important. If it's checked, and in fact, let me demo that. So I don't just talk about it in the abstract. I will go back and undo that copy, turn on the background layer visibility. Now, let me again sample the hat, and let's say I want to start copying here. I'm going to click and drag and release, and then I'm going to click and drag a second time and release. Okay, what it's done is on that second click and drag, it picked up right where I left off. Right? Let me undo that. And now I'll uncheck aligned and do that exact same interaction. I'll sample the hat, click and drag down and release, then click and drag down and release. Okay, now you see the difference is the second time I cloned, it went back to the starting sample point to do the copy. Okay, sometimes you want that, sometimes you would like to have it pick up where you left off. I almost always have it picked up where I left off, so I almost always have aligned checked. And I'll show you this last setting, where it samples from. I can either sample just on the layer I'm working on, or I can sample on that layer and every layer below that's visible. So in this case, I have to do current and below because this is a brand new layer. There's nothing on it. If I just sample this layer, there would be no pixels to copy. I almost always leave this on current and below. That's just the way I tend to use the clone stamp. All right, so that's sort of all the important parameters of the clone stamp. Now let's put it to work and see how we can actually remove the stray people in this image using this clone stamp tool. So I'll delete that just teaching layer that we put there, the layer 13. And let's look up the layer stack here and see what work I've done to take the stray people out of this image. Okay, this next layer up, layer 1, you can see takes out some of the people in the image here. Now, how did I do that? Well, I did it with the clone stamp, and let's try and reconstruct what I did there. Now, in an image like this, where I'm what I call cloning out or removing with the clone stamp, where I'm cloning out something that runs up against an object where I don't want it cloned, I'm going to have to create a selection or mask so to stop the cloning where I want it stopped. In this image, if we look at the whole retouch, I know that I'm going to need a mask of the girl here, because in addition to just doing the cloning, I'm going to also adjust the tone and the color of this girl who's my focal point or foreground element independently of the rest of the picture. So I'm going to need a mask that selects her in any event, and it turns out that that would be just a perfect thing to help me do this selective cloning right now. So I might as well go ahead and make that selection and mask right now, and then I can use it for both purposes. So here, let me option click again on the background layer, and let's make a selection of just our girl here. I'm going to use my quick mask selection tool. I'm going to zoom in a click with Command plus, and I'm just going to make that size of that brush about the size of her hat. I'm going to click and release. You can see it did a nice job of selecting, and since I have the plus in the middle, the brush is in plus mode. Every time I click, it's going to add to the selection. There's nice sharp edges on this element in the picture, and lo and behold, this quick select tool is doing a wonderful job of selecting just the girl. Now with her shoes, I'm going to have to zoom in a little, zoom in a little more. So I'll do a few Command pluses. My selection brush is too big, so I'll scale it down with the left bracket. Click and release, scale it down, click and release. Get that toe. So very, very quickly, I'm going to Command 0 to zoom out. I've got almost, a really good mask. I'll hit this Select and Mask button up here to refine the edge, push the radius up a couple of pixels, push the smoothing up a couple of pixels. Let me zoom in, Command plus again. I can see there's a little defect here just off her left arm, so I'm going to go get my third brush here, which is Add and Subtract. I'm going to hold down Option to change it to Alt, and I'm just going to stroke over that to take out that part. That's not bad. I mean, there's a little piece right between her legs here that I need to take out, but I'm not going to bother with that in this tutorial. So let's call that a reasonable mask. I'll click OK. So now I have a selection that includes just the girl and excludes everything else. If I tap the Q key to go from the marching ants display to quick mask mode with the Ruby overlay, you can see that everything except the girl is masked out. Now, I can use that mask to help me limit the cloning or the taking out of these background people, because it does separate the girl from the background. All right, so let's make a new RGB layer. I'll click on this Make a New Layer. There it is. And for this layer, I know I'm going to do some retouching, but I never want to clone over the part of the image that's the girl. So I need a mask that's just the opposite of the selection that I have now. The mask I have now selects the girl and not the background. But if I hit Command-Shift-I, which is Control-Shift-I on the PC, it'll just invert the mask or selection. So now if I hit the Q key for Quick Mask, you can see only the girl is masked and everything else is not. That's perfect for this cloning operation. So now that I have that, I'll hit this little icon at the bottom of the layer stack to add a layer mask. So now on this blank layer, I'm selecting only the part of the image that's not the girl. Perfect for my cloning. So now I'll click on the RGB icon for that layer, zoom in a few clicks, and now I'm ready to start cloning. Let me scroll down a little bit, get the clone stamp, make sure my hardness is 0 for the nice soft edge. That is. Now I'll tap my left bracket key to scale it down, and I'm going to start copying pixels from the wall right above this switch or whatever this is down below it. So I'll hold down my Alt Option and sample there, move the mouse to where I want to copy to, and stroke down, release, stroke down, and now that switch is almost gone. I see there's just remnants of it left, so we'll fix that up. All right, so now that switch is gone, I can go down and start working on the head of this this stray person here. Now, if I'm going to be, let me zoom in just one more, Command plus. If I'm going to do a nice thorough job here, I should continue these seams in the stone right on over. So what I'll do in that case is I'll make my clone brush a little smaller. I'm going to sample the image right on the seam there and go over to where I want that seam continued, right about there, and click and drag. Okay, so now we're copying pixels from left to right, and since we've aligned that seam just the way we want it, it's copying just the way we want it. Now, we can see when we get really near our girl here, we can see we've got a little halo. And if I shift-click on the mask, you can see that the mask is preventing us from seeing the pixels that are right next to her. Now, I just need to go fix up my mask for this. So let's take a brief diversion here from the clone stamp. Let's go get our paintbrush. Let's up the flow to 100%. Let's up the hardness to something like 50%. That brush is just a little too big, so let's zoom it down. We'll go in another click. And now we're going to brush white paint on the mask right where we would like to see more of our newly replaced and cloned pixels. Right there. There we go. And now we're fixing up the mask that's separating our foreground and background elements here. Right about like that. Okay, that's better. All right, I'm going to do a Command minus to zoom back out. And now let's continue fixing up or taking that person out. I'll click on the RGB pixels for layer 13, go get my clone stamp again, and let's continue copying pixels from left to right again. I see there's a funny seam here, so I'll sample here, start there, and clone down. That looks pretty good. Click here and go left to right. I'll click here, go left to right. Now, to take this seam out, we have less to work with, so I'll make a much smaller clone stamp brush, but use the same technique of going left to right and just extending that seam in the stone over so it looks like it's covering. And we'll continue that process all the way down, all right, until that person is totally removed. Do a little more. Okay, you get the idea. When I get down to the floor, I can do this same strategy, right? I can go get this tile here. Let's make our clone stamp a little bigger. And let's sample from right about here and go to where we would like to extend that tile in the floor, and just again copy left to right, but extending the floor tile so that it's going to cover. There we go. You can see I'm picking up some of the floor tile there. And those repeated patterns are things you want to avoid. Those are easily detected as image fix-ups, so you want to avoid those repeated patterns when you're doing your cloning, and just be careful of those. If you see them, just go get another part of the image and knock them out. All right, that's essentially how I took out the person right next to our foreground element here. I didn't complete it, but just so to save time, let me go back to my original layer 11 there, and I took out a lot of the person on the left here using the same strategy. Now, to finish taking out that person on the left, though, I had to shift strategies, because no amount of cloning from my original image is going to find this edge of the pedestal, the back edge of this pedestal. That just wasn't in my initial shot. So I have to use some other strategy to finish taking out this person and restore the back edge of that pedestal. And what I've chosen to do in this image is add another layer. It's called layer 2. And let me turn off the layer mask for that. And what you can see is it's just a second shot of this same scene, but when I took that shot, there was no person standing in front of the statue. Now, what I've done with the layer mask is I've just taken the parts of that second shot that I want. So by turning the layer mask back on, in fact, let me Option or Alt click on that so you can see, white reveals, black conceals. So I've used black on the mask to obscure the parts of that second image that I didn't need to take out the person in this one. So this is, again, just sort of basic compositing. And if you want to see other examples of this, go look at the other segments in this workshop. There's one on eye replacement, where I explain combining images from 2 shots. Then also the segment on boring skies will show you how to take pixels from a second shot and add it as a layer in this image. All right, so that's basically the strategy for taking people out of this image. It's the clone stamp. It's a very powerful tool. The first time you use it, you will be disappointed in the results. I can almost guarantee it. It takes some practice, but it's such a powerful tool that it's worth the investment to learn it, because you can not only take people out of your pictures, but you can add and subtract other elements that can improve your composition. All right, now this segment's getting longer than I had intended, so I want to show you a couple more examples of images where I've taken out straight people. But rather than go through and explain the whole retouch on them, I'll just show you what I've done so you can get some more ideas. We'll finish up the retouch on this image by turning on all the rest of the layers, and you can see in addition to taking out the straight people, I've changed the tone and the color and sort of made that foreground element pop. Let's go on and look at the next example. This is some people at a Roaring Twenties party that are just having a good time. And the rendering I wanted was a little less realistic and a little more cartoonish and almost like a caricature. So this is the rendering I wanted. And if I go back to the bottom layer of the layer stack, here's the capture with most of the person on the right cropped out. But you can see your chin is just sticking in the picture, and I didn't want that. So we'll start going up the layer stack. Here's the layer called collar, where I've taken out that chin and made it appear we can see the man's collar. How did I do that? It's the clone stamp. And then the rest of the layers are changing the tone and the color and taking out detail, etc., to get that rendering that I was after. My last example I call To New York with Love. It was taken on the roof of the Met Museum in New York City. And in the summers, they've had outdoor exhibits up there that are really nice. And this one was this curved piece of glass that you could see your reflection in. and it was kind of distorted like a carnival mirror. So here's a tourist taking her picture in the curved glass. Well, in fact, she wasn't alone. If I look at the capture, she had a couple of people with her, but I thought she was, far more photogenic than her companions. So in the retouch, let's go and look at that now. And if I go again, look at the bottommost layer. That's what I started with. Then I have, in this layer, taken out her two companions. I've taken some of her out too, so I'll need to restore that. The next layer up, I've put back some ivy on the lower left of the wall. Done more of it there. Finished it off there. Here I'm taking the trash liner out of that waste container. And here I'm restoring my subject, brightening up her hand holding the phone because I want to draw your attention to that. And then enriching the clarity and the contrast with a final layer. So those are my examples of taking people out of images, and as I mentioned before, those same techniques you can use to add and remove other kinds of elements into your renderings. Very powerful technique. You won't be happy the first time you try it, but stick with it because it's really useful technique. All right, that'll wrap it up for this segment. If you found this useful, please click on the thumbs up like button and go check out my workshop on jimchristensenphotography.com.